A child prodigy gifted with an affinity for the dark side of the Force, Darth Zannah was the apprentice of the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Bane. The fabled Sithari, or perfect being of legend, Bane was the visionary figure who destroyed Lord Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness and restructured the Sith Order under the rule of two. By operating in secrecy, the Sith were now free to slowly and subtly undermine the integrity of the Galactic Republic and patiently work toward the downfall of their ancient enemies, the Jedi Knights. This also marked the beginning of a crucial reform within the Sith ranks. By limiting their numbers to only 2, they would exploit, rather than suffer, from the inevitable infighting that plagued their order so often throughout their earlier history. This new system ensured that an apprentice could only stake a claim to the mantle of Dark Lord if they proved strong or cunning enough to challenge and defeat their master on their own. The idea being that the Sith would grow stronger with each successive apprentice. A powerful Sith sorceress, Zannah eventually lived up to Darth Bane's expectations when she defeated her former master after a grueling duel on Umbria, a world steeped in the dark side of the Force. Immediately thereafter, she took an apprentice of her own, an Iktachi assassin named Darth Cognis, whom Bane had selected for Sith training. Together, the two set about carrying out the Sithari's imperative. They turned all of their efforts toward bringing about the destruction of the Jedi and the covert ascendancy of the Sith Order by perpetuating the all-important Rule of Two.
Nearly 1,000 years would pass until Bane and Zannah's imperative would finally come to fruition. And over the course of these many centuries, the Sorceress's lightsaber would be passed down through entire generations of Darksiders, until a particularly fatal encounter on an unnamed world saw the weapon fall into the claws of the infamous CIS commander, General Grievous. Born Kumaran J. Shilal on the border world of Kali, Grievous was a celebrated warrior amongst his people who rose to prominence during the Huk invasion some 30-odd years before the Battle of Yavin. During the conflict, he fought alongside the warrior Rodero Lij Kumar, and the two quickly gained notoriety for their martial and strategic talents. Following Kumar's death in battle, the heartbroken Shilal renounced his birth name and waged a genocidal campaign against the Huk that brought the conflict straight to their homeworld. In desperation, the Huk appealed to the Galactic Republic for aid, feigning an appearance of innocence and portraying the Kaleesh as the aggressors. Jedi Knights sent to stop the war sided with the Huk, and hefty fines and embargoes came down upon the Kaleesh. Kali ultimately ended up in poverty, and hundreds of thousands of Kaleesh starved to death. Backed into a corner, Grievous was forced to accept a position as a debt collector for the intergalactic banking clan in exchange for economic aid to his people. However, he retained his warrior spirit, and in the wake of renewed hostilities with the Huk, he abandoned his post and returned home to lead his people once again. Though initially successful in rallying his people, things would take a turn for the worst when the IBC, now in league with the Sith Lord Count Dooku, sabotaged Grievous's personal shuttle, resulting in a crash that left the general at death's door. Suspended in a Bacta tank, banking clan chairman San Hill presented Grievous with a new offer. He could die, or he could be rebuilt as a cyborg and step up as the supreme military commander of the newly formed Confederacy of Independent Systems in the coming war, which would give him the ability to exact revenge on the Republic and the Jedi Order for their part in the devastation of Kali. When the Clone Wars finally erupted in 22 BBY, General Grievous's military acumen allowed him to inflict costly victories on the Republic's clone army, while his cyborg enhancement combined with Count Dooku's training allowed him to become one of the most infamous Jedi killers to ever live. In 19 BBY, Grievous led the Confederate Navy in the Battle of Coruscant, an attack on the Republic's capital. Grievous killed several Jedi and took Supreme Chancellor Palpatine hostage. However, before the General's flagship, the Invisible Hand, could jump to hyperspace, Palpatine was rescued by the Jedi heroes Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, the latter of whom was also successful in killing Dooku. Grievous fled to the Outer Rim world of Utapau, but was ultimately hunted down and slain by Kenobi following a titanic battle through Pau City. At some point after Grievous's death, his body, along with Darth Zannah's lightsaber, would be salvaged to create the droid warrior NK Necrosis, who considered himself to be the living reincarnation of the fabled general. However, the droid was killed shortly after his creation by a group of spacers. Hey guys, EvanNova95 and Grey Jedi 91 here, and welcome to the second collaboration matchup here on Versus Series Season 7. Today, we are pitting the Sith Sorceress Darth Zannah against the CIS Commander, General Grievous. Yeah, kinda random, but seeing as Grievous was defeated by Obi-Wan Kenobi, I've always enjoyed the concept of pitting the Jedi Hunter against other great masters of Surisu. It gives me the chance to showcase how a particular lightsaber form can be executed in wildly different ways. For that reason, I was originally going to examine this matchup purely on the martial arts front as a versus short. However, after a brief discussion with my friend Matt, we decided that there was enough material here to warrant a full analysis, and seeing as we haven't worked together in a while, we felt the opportunity was too good to pass up. Just to be clear, while Matt's breakdown of Darth Zannah will draw from all of her appearances, my breakdown of General Grievous will draw exclusively from the Legends continuity. While Matt and I are a bit more ambivalent towards TCW than some of our peers, we can at least agree that their portrayal of Grievous differed vastly from what was originally portrayed. The thing of it is, we don't have an aversion to using TCW material on principle. In the case of characters who are portrayed consistently from their earlier iterations within the Clone Wars multimedia project and their later appearances in TCW, there's no problem merging the two sources. But with certain characters, there's really no getting around it. At some point, you have to make the choice between the two versions, as they may as well be two completely different characters. Grievous is not the only character like this, but he is perhaps the most notorious. The two versions are completely incompatible. Now then, when Mace Windu spoke to Obi-Wan Kenobi just prior to the Battle of Utapau, he proclaimed him to be the Master of Surisu. Can a Master of Surisu fare just as well? Let's find out.
Darth Zannah was a human female who remained solidly within the prime of her life, being aged in her early to mid-30s by the time of Dynasty of Evil. Attributed with high levels of adaptability and resiliency, humans still lacked many of the more exotic and extreme environmental adaptations developed by so many of the alien races who inhabited the galaxy. After years of Sith training, Zannah was described as having the body of a gymnast, being lean, lithe, and strong. Where she truly excelled was with her speed and agility, which she honed to a level that allowed her to dart around and avoid opponents of superior physical ability, or else to dodge and evade her competitors during situations where she found herself outnumbered. For visual reference, I would consider the general levels of speed and agility displayed by Asajj Ventress indicative of what I would envision for Zannah. This is based on her general performance level in battle, as well as her force-enhanced escape from the self-destruct-enabled stone prison on Done. As far as her tolerance for physical pain is concerned, she has weathered blows from her master Darth Bane, sustained force-enhanced kicks to the face, and continued to fight after suffering broken ribs, though her level of performance deteriorated somewhat under such conditions, and she has even struggled to maintain consciousness on at least one occasion after being struck by an elbow to the jaw from her master. Distinguished by her physical beauty, lustrous curls of blonde hair, and lack of dark side degradation, Darth Zannah was otherwise rather mundane with respect to physical ability, at least when compared to other master-level Force sensitives. When viewed next to Bane's accomplishments, her limitations are cast into sharper relief because it's easy and almost natural for one to compare the apprentice to the master, Bane's pain threshold, endurance, stamina, and strength are all well above the general standard of even most Master-level Force sensitives, fellow Dark Lords and Jedi Council Masters included. Darth Zannah simply isn't built the same way, and she pales in comparison to her master in that particular regard. However, this, in and of itself, shouldn't be taken as too much of a slight against her. She was still able to keep pace with and defend against the hulking behemoth that was Darth Bane, and would be perfectly well equipped to take on the vast majority of potential adversaries. All in all, Darth Zannah was a tough and capable figure with solid physical attributes under her belt. Nevertheless, she suffered from her fair share of limitations.
Well, I think the thumbnail kind of makes this point obvious enough. General Grievous's physical makeup was about as far removed from Darth Zannah's as one could possibly be. Generally native to the acrid jungles of Kali, the Kaleesh were a race of reptilian humanoids noted for their deep spirituality and warlike tendencies. While Shelob no doubt possessed a formidable physique by the standards of his race due to his extensive time on the battlefield, they paled in comparison to his abilities as a cyborg killing machine. In contrast to the rushed, overlaying construction of Darth Vader, Grievous was rebuilt methodically and from the ground up, with only his heart, lungs, brain, and spinal column being retained. Encased in a nightmarish shell intended to dominate, General Grievous's levels of physical performance were intended to rival and surpass those of high-level Jedi. And barring the occasional slip-up, he very much lived up to those expectations. Combat computers and peripheral processors slaved to his brain gave him the ability to think and react far beyond the sentient norm, which in turn allowed him to utilize his cybernetic attributes to their fullest effect. In terms of strength, Grievous was nothing less than astounding. He has crushed a human Jedi's skull with ease, thrown around 123-kilogram Magna Guards, shredded metal doors, and has repeatedly matched the force enhancement of Council-level adepts like Count Dooku and Mace Windu. Moving into speed, several sources have credited the general as one of the fastest beings of his era. He had no trouble moving faster than the human eye could perceive, nor did he struggle with higher-end feats like dodging blaster fire or the aforementioned keeping up with Council-level adepts. While he generally favored standardized humanoid stances when at rest, all of General Grievous's joints possessed an omnidirectional range of motion, which allowed him to perform otherwise impossible feats of agility. This advantage was further reinforced by the fact that his arms and hands could divide lengthwise, granting him 2 separate sets. If that wasn't intimidating enough, given that his clawed feet could be used as hands and repulsor lifts built into his legs allowed him to hover, it was actually possible for Grievous to wield up to 6 lightsabers simultaneously, though he has never been shown doing so, much to Matt's relief. Shifting to durability, Grievous's chassis was comprised of a mix of duranium and durasteel, both incredibly durable metals used for various forms of construction, including starships. By his own estimation, he could withstand a blast from a starfighter's laser cannon, and he has even survived being at the center of an explosion which engulfed and devastated an underground city on Gentis. Unsurprisingly, for someone with those kinds of attributes, conventional weapons like slug throwers, vibroblades, and electrostaffs were all but useless against his metallic exoskeleton. That said, he wasn't without his limits. While the reinforced plating on his back appeared to possess some resistance to lightsabers, the rest of his body was just as vulnerable as anything else, and the remaining organs contained within his gut sac were his most consistent weakness. Case dismissed. Oh, you want us to actually explain this? Okay, fair enough.
In terms of physical strength, Darth Zannah has been repeatedly noted to be inferior to her master Darth Bane, a fact she herself acknowledged in Dynasty of Evil. And although you could be forgiven for thinking the same wouldn't hold true in terms of alacrity based on their physical appearances, there has never been any point at which Zannah has been able to leverage a speed advantage over Darth Bane. In the lead-up to her final bout with her master, she even had to remind herself that Bane was incredibly agile despite his muscular bulk. This means that even if you wanted to argue that she may technically outstrip Bane on some level in the realm of speed or agility, it would only be by a negligible margin. In fact, between the two, where a contest of pure physical ability is concerned, it is only Zannah herself who falls short in certain categories, most notably durability. The most clear example being when a singular kick from her master left her with a broken rib. To her credit, she managed to regain her footing and went on to best him, but her level of physical performance took a nosedive after this point, whereupon she was forced to implement her Sith sorcery. Compare this to her master's superior physical performance in the wake of sustaining far worse injuries. The final stage of this exact same duel is just one of several examples I could choose from. To put it simply, when she's at her most honest, even Darth Zannah herself would probably admit that she cannot truly compete with the likes of Darth Bane on a purely physical level, at least not indefinitely. This is most especially true because she utterly lacks his near-inhuman pain tolerance.
And everything we have said about Darth Bane can also be applied to Grievous, and then some. In regards to pure physical strength and speed, Grievous is at the very least on par with Darth Bane, as well as boasting superior agility, durability, and stamina. While it is true that High Council level masters like Obi-Wan Kenobi have proven that sufficient force augmentation can endow a fighter to the point where they can overcome Grievous's cybernetics, this has only ever been done through heavy force channeling, and even then, not easily. In the same way as her master, due to her innate inferiority, the best Zannah could realistically hope for would be to cope with what Grievous is bringing to the table. She is not going to be able to dominate him in a head-to-head engagement. It's true that Darth Bane would almost certainly be able to duplicate Kenobi's feat of bending Grievous's duranium alloy forearm with his bare hands, but Zannah's baseline physical might is so much lower that she would cap out before she reached that point. In fact, the only area where we could see Zannah employing force augmentation to a level beyond that of Grievous would be in her ability to outrun him on foot. But this would amount to her effectively quitting the contest and conceding the fight. In all other regards, Grievous outstrips her, and this is before we consider his extra limbs and literally inhuman physical hardiness and agility.
In conclusion, Darth Zannah is a physical lightweight who works well with what she has, all things considered, but here she's just got a major uphill battle ahead of her. General Grievous gets the physical edge. Darth Zannah was a master of Surisu, the third form of lightsaber combat. Almost purely defensive in nature, Surisu was originally developed by the Jedi as a response to the increase in availability of blaster technology throughout the galaxy, though it later became an expression of purely defensive, non-violent action. While an unusual style for a Sith apprentice to study almost exclusively, given its philosophical roots in defense rather than offense, the decision was made out of practicality in Zannah's case, as her master knew her light physique and slight build would leave her ill-suited to the strength-oriented martial arts. The form was characterized by tight, efficient movements in order to provide maximum defensive coverage and to conserve energy. In-universe, supreme masters of the art have long been considered to be unbeatable. Despite this, Zannah has been disarmed by her master, though not without great effort on his part. Zannah's own weapon was designed specifically to bolster her defensive style. She wielded a saber staff with slightly shorter blades than were commonplace. The weapon's design allowed her to create an impenetrable wall of defense. Her master instructed her to control her weapon by flicking her wrists rather than the whole of her arm, grounding her weapon close to her body and keeping the blades cycling in a constant twirling motion. Her application of Surisu meant that she operated by deflecting, redirecting, and shunting aside opposing lightsaber blades without meeting them head-on, waiting for opponents to tire themselves out, whereupon she would close in to score a killing blow. Bane taught his apprentice to use the Force for the purposes of battle precognition. This enabled her to sense the potential actions of her opponents and narrow down the infinite matrix of possibilities down to only the most likely of outcomes. The ideal theory for Zannah was never to dominate the combat, but rather to predict and control the proceedings of the engagement. She did put all of her eggs into one basket, which made her style something of a calculated risk, as she couldn't really hope to overpower her opponents directly. However, that gambit almost always paid off, as her style granted her parity with opponents who were physically mightier than her, as well as were more skilled in lightsaber combat in general. When faced with opponents at around or beneath her own level of ability, Zannah's skill with Surisu proved to be truly devastating, as she would be capable of stonewalling their offensives before transitioning to an offensive sequence of her own in order to end the fight swiftly and decisively on her own terms. Against true master duelists equipped with similar strength in the Force, however, all she could do was buy herself time and hope that they would either tire themselves out or wait for an opening where she could exploit her Force abilities to come into play. However, this isn't to say that she was always 100% successful at accomplishing this. Against the likes of Sarozaj and Darth Bane, she could do little more than bat aside their assaults while in a full-blown retreat, all the while biding her time to employ her Sith magics. On both occasions, somewhat flawed tactical observations, less than perfect footwork, and general inattentiveness to the surrounding environment got her boxed into tight corners or else tripped her up, leaving her scrambling with her back on the ground. Less commonly but still worthy of note, Zannah's tactical outlook has left a bit to be desired as well, as she has failed to accurately read her opponents in the moment, such as when Darth Bane baited her into attacking him on Done by fooling her into thinking he was extremely vulnerable while unarmed. She willingly, and by her own later admission, foolishly, attempted a stance she was by no means familiar with, and it cost her what might have been an easy victory. Finally, while it is technically true that Darth Zannah killed the most Jedi during the infamous duel on Tython while still an apprentice, this was highly circumstantial due to the fact that she had the aid of her master, as well as the incompetence of Johun Othon working to her benefit, which allowed her to seize the advantage when and where it mattered. I often find my fellow fans tend to overestimate Zannah's abilities based on her body count on Tython, even though it seemed clear to me that if she'd been forced to fight Sarozaj alone from the outset, she would have lost. Though I'm sure some will not agree, Zannah's shortcomings are as apparent to me as are her many accomplishments. To round things out, it does bear mentioning that the breadth of her experience has afforded her with opportunities to identify, and more importantly, test her mettle against a wide variety of fighting styles, with Ataru, Gemso, Naman, and Jiyo among them. She didn't possess the ability to overpower most of her adversaries, but she was normally able to cope. All in all, as impressive as her abilities with the blade clearly are, purely with respect to her martial training, all Zannah really has on her side is a shield and patience. As Kreia herself said of Surisu, when used exclusively, all one is going to be able to do is delay the inevitable.
Already a skilled swordsman during his days on Kali, General Grievous's cyborg enhancements coupled with Count Dooku's training in the Jedi arts crafted him into one of the most formidable lightsaber duelists of the era, and the most successful Jedi killer of the Clone Wars. In regards to historical reputation, Grievous was viewed by the wider galactic populace as the arbiter behind the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And while this obviously wasn't true in the literal sense, his conquest of many planets certainly helped spread things around. As noted by the novel Labyrinth of Evil, not only did Count Dooku consider Grievous to be more than a match for most Jedi, but his skills were advanced to the point where Dooku was actually hard-pressed to outduel him in their sparring sessions. The Count purposefully neglecting to teach him everything he knew, presumably as a safeguard to being overthrown by the cyborg. Keep in mind, this is the same Dooku who schools reigning masters left and right and can stand up to Yoda. So, yeah, that's some pretty hefty praise. Moving into feats, General Grievous has bested hundreds of Jedi, from the lowliest of Padawans to the most renowned of Jedi Masters. His most notable victories were against Council Masters Shak Ti, Ki-Adi-Mundi, and Adi Gallia, besting the former two on Hypori, and killing the latter on Boz Pity. He has also managed to hold his own against Mace Windu, very nearly equaling the Master of the Order when they fought atop a maglev train during the Battle of Coruscant. A few months later, Grievous would face another counselor in the form of Obi-Wan Kenobi on Utapau. And while this engagement did ultimately result in the general's death, he still gave the powerful Jedi one hell of a fight before going down. Moving into technique, General Grievous's attributes were most heavily fleshed out in the aforementioned novel Labyrinth of Evil, and its direct sequel, The Revenge of the Sith novelization. As noted by both sources, Grievous was essentially a walking database of martial knowledge, having mastered all 7 forms of lightsaber combat as well as various alternative disciplines like marksmanship, unarmed combat, and whatever loose ma is supposed to be. While the general practiced each of the Jedi fighting styles with equal proficiency, his clear preference for dual wielding, coupled with the fact that many of his opponents have made note of Dooku's clear influence on his technique, strongly suggests that Jar Kai and Makashi were of a particular favor. Unsurprising, given that both arts shared an emphasis on blade-to-blade combat. Armed with 4 standard single-bladed lightsabers with blue and green blades, General Grievous's offensive technique was both technically sophisticated and utterly bewildering. Rather than passively switching saber forms in response to his opponent's actions, he would instead take a more active approach by switching styles on the fly in order to confuse and undermine their defenses. This chameleon-style attack sequence was facilitated by the cyborg's omnidirectional mechanical anatomy, as well as his ability to analyze and copy the fighting styles of his opponents. The most notable instance being when he copied the physical technique of Vapad during his fight with Mace Windu. Grievous's actual physical technique typically fell within one of 3 distinct fighting modes. His single-bladed offense paired off hacking cleaves with integrated physical combat techniques, his multifaceted attacks never giving his targets a moment to regain their composure. His dual-bladed offensive paired off heavy power blows with dynamic footwork and acrobatics, gaining momentum and hammering a target's defenses. His quad-bladed offense was based around complex attack sequences paired off with more grounded stances. The Revenge of the Sith novelization describes Grievous as spinning, and I quote, all 4 of them in a flourishing velocity so fast and so seamlessly integrated that he seemed to stand within a pulsing sphere of blue and green energy. And during his fight with Kenobi, he maintained a continuous assault of 12 strikes per second, and was able to crank it up even higher to a staggering 20 strikes per second. If that wasn't impressive enough, the novel also describes each of these 1-second strikes as coming from a different angle with different speed and intensity. An unpredictably broken rhythm of slashes, chops, and stabs none but the reigning master of Surisu could even hope to defend against. Speaking of defense, General Grievous's skill in this area was much simpler but no less effective. He had no trouble deflecting or evading blaster fire from skilled marksmen, nor was he all that vulnerable against integrated physical combat techniques, metal body and all that. When engaging in a lightsaber duel, he typically relied on static blocks and whirling parries to arrest an enemy's momentum, often linking 2 or more of his blades together to create a makeshift shield, or spinning his blades in a continuous circle in a manner not too dissimilar from Zannah's own. These techniques were further reinforced by his use of feints, drawing an opponent's attention with one weapon while slipping in another to bypass their defenses and score hits. Though unquestionably arrogant and easily confused by unpredictability, General Grievous was a vicious and pragmatic tactical fighter, distinguished by his quick thinking and utter disregard for intelligent life. In military engagements, he typically employed brutal surprise attacks, bringing his forces right on top of the enemy and laying into them before they could respond. Though the arrangement of his forces often appeared random and unfocused, in reality, this was done as an intentional ploy to force the enemy to divide their attention and conceal his true strategic objective. This emphasis on shock and awe layered with unsuspected sabotage carried over to Grievous's tactics in single combat. Almost always the instigator, his first action was theatrical posturing to unbalance his target's psyche, which was then followed up by a progressively escalating heavy offensive, taking their measure by analyzing their style, then dismantling them before they could respond in kind. When examining the approaches of Darth Zannah and General Grievous, it is important to acknowledge that the two share a distinct commonality. Strategically speaking, they're both incredibly analytical and adaptive, but their individual skill sets and tools yield inverse results.
While Grievous's breadth of training and experience exceeds Zannah's singular mastery of Surisu, her skill set was almost tailor-made to compensate for this gap. She has the training to identify the chosen styles of her opponents, Setharth being the best example, though I would also note her ability to identify Darth Bane's sudden style shift from Gemso to Juyo in their last bout. I have said many times in the past that the only tools Zannah has in her corner are a shield and patience. However, to her credit, this wasn't actually the sum total of what she had to work with. Her analytical mind was always primed to interpret and respond to what her opponents were bringing to the table, and her success rate speaks for itself. Despite the fact she only ever mastered one fighting form, there is a reason why she successfully contended with a battle meditation amped weapons master in training who had assistance on Tython, and why she was able to outright toy with Setharth on Nal Hutta. These incidents, coupled with her own ability to stand against Darth Bane, prove the merit of her strategy. She has what it takes to succeed against a wide array of opponents, tailoring her defenses and counteroffensives around her ability to read and predict them. The problem was, she was only optimized for this one tactic. She can only respond and react. She can never take the initiative.
Grievous is the opposite. Where Zannah is constantly reading her opponents and figuring out how to best employ her shield, Grievous's computers are always busy at work attempting to break down, duplicate, and counter what his opponents are coming at him with. Like a Swiss Army knife, he will pull out whatever the situation calls for. He's not merely using a shield. Rather, he is attempting to use sword and shield, club and spear, each in turn or perhaps all at once against his opponents. And when possible, he will use their own weapons against them. The best example of this was his bout with Mace Windu on Coruscant. Grievous had no familiarity with Vapad before that engagement, yet after a single exchange with Vapad's creator and sole active master, he was able to approximate a close enough facsimile so formidable that Mace opted to lean more heavily on his force abilities to end the fight. This difference of technical execution carries over to the differences between Darth Zannah's application of Surisu and Obi-Wan Kenobi's. In an almost perfect allegory for their opposing views on the Force, Zannah views her defensive sequences as a tool, where Kenobi views it as the ultimate expression of his pacifist mentality. Both can execute their sequences with technical perfection, but Zannah is constantly having to keep her brain in hyperdrive mode in order to assess her environment and her opponent's tactics. She can perform Surisu's movesets without conscious thought due to her rigorous years of training, but she remains highly present in the moment in order to formulate her battle plans and respond to what her opponents are bringing to the table. In contrast, when he's performing at his peak, Kenobi isn't truly there. Kenobi gets out of the way and allows the Force to take over. Kenobi lets the Force flow through him and guide his blade. One is overthinking every little move, while the other is barely having to think at all. This continual need to focus entirely on execution and her opponent in order to maintain composure leaves Zannah at a disadvantage against Grievous. It's the equivalent to a computer of flesh attempting to compete with an actual computer. She is forced to remain mentally present in a manner which Kenobi does not have to. More to the point, he can't be anything more than what he is. Kenobi operates the way he does because that's just who he is at his core.
This is why he can simply stand, why he can simply wait. He has no need to attack or to defend. There will be battle here, but he is perfectly at ease, perfectly content to let the battle start when it will start, and let it end when it will end. Just as he will let himself live or let himself die. This is how a great Jedi makes war.
Last but not least, there are the issues revolving around the respective choices of weapon. Even on the best of occasions, saber staffs were more difficult to wield than their standard brothers in general, as they posed a great risk to the wielder and negated many of the traditional maneuvers due to the manner in which they had to be handled. In addition, the fact that Zannah's core technique was dependent upon the ability to spin her weapon in a constant twirling motion means that the more obstructions she encounters, the less viable she'll become. Zannah's custom weapon boasted certain design elements which differed from the norm, meant to bolster her personalized fighting form, and the uniquely attuned Bane's Heart lightsaber crystal implanted within the weapon emitted electrical discharges whenever a foreign hand attempted to operate it. Despite this slight variance in functionality, in terms of construction, it is still very much your standard double saber at the end of the day. Close quarters fighting is going to be a problem for her, pure and simple, and the chances of Grievous inhibiting her protective wall by pinning her blades are very great. This isn't to say that Zannah's modifications were in any way responsible for this or faulty. Rather, the saber staff is simply a generally poor option to combat somebody like Grievous specifically. Given the ergonomics of the double-bladed lightsaber, defensive sequences with the weapon almost always followed a wide sweeping structure. This is especially pertinent for this particular matchup because the Fight Saber article, which originally detailed the 7 traditional forms of lightsaber combat, specifically noted that a wide defense is extremely dangerous to employ against 4 incoming lightsabers.
According to the Sith Blade Master, Lord Kasim, one of the major advantages of the saber staff was actually its novelty. Outside of a few given eras, such as the Jedi Civil War and the Great Galactic War, during which it saw heavier usage amongst the Jedi and Sith alike, the saber staff was a relatively rare weapon, and users were often able to exploit an opponent's lack of familiarity with it. However, as Kasim went on to say, true masters of the saber staff are all well aware that this advantage is purely psychological, and is largely undone when pitted against an opponent with the necessary relevant experience. Grievous, who has trained electrostaff-wielding Magna Guards, has the necessary relevant experience.
Through knowing the location of one of Zannah's blades, he automatically knows the location of the other. Moreover, Grievous's unnatural physiology affords him an even greater boon, as he may have as many as 4 arms, hands, and blades of his own ready to counter. Potentially what he can do is to use 2 of his arms to lock up Zannah's blades, and use the remaining 2 to either cut her to pieces or else damage her weapon, leaving her defenseless. While we don't have a direct example of this technique being employed against a saber-staff wielder in lore, think of it as something akin to what the Jedi Battlemaster, Kaosin Durach, pulled off against the Sith Lord Vindican in the Old Republic opening cinematic, aka the Return trailer. A move like that could only be executed through a combination of the ability to predict opposing styles of combat and intimate understanding of the saber staff's properties, and the usage of multiple weapons. Essentially, the role Keo played on that occasion was that of Grievous Light, seeing as how the good general possesses 4 arms to Keo's 2 and 4 blades to Keo's 3. And for what it's worth, Grievous has already employed this exact strategy to eliminate the renegade Jedi Knight, Bedard Tone. Bedard may not have been employing a saber staff, but the important thing to focus on here is the precise technique Grievous employed, as it was the same in principle. At the end of the day, all of this spells nothing but trouble for Darth Zannah.
General Grievous gets the edge as a martial artist and combat strategist.
From the very beginning of her association with the Order of the Sith Lords, it was clear that Darth Zannah possessed both a frightening command of the Force as well as a seemingly instinctive affinity for the dark side of the Force specifically. This rare combination made her an excellent candidate for the study of Sith sorcery, which her master encouraged her to pursue with gusto, despite the fact his own ability to guide her down that road was extremely limited. Sith sorcerers were born, not made, and Bane did not possess this gift.
Obviously, as a non-Force sensitive, General Grievous possesses no powers to speak of. That said, his experience combating Jedi and his technological enhancements have afforded him a wide array of contingencies for just such abilities. His education under Dooku emphasized psychological warfare over and above all else, breaking his opponents before he engaged them and keeping them from bringing their full power to bear.
Although Zannah was of course trained primarily as a Sith sorceress, she possessed the more traditional powers as well. Her Force-enhanced physical attributes were nothing short of masterful, though admittedly the same could be said for every member of the Rule of Two, and most Jedi Council members as well for that matter.
As noted previously, Grievous can do the same through different means. Still, the point remains. Her ability to draw on the Force to facilitate her physical prowess isn't going to be able to prove equal to the task of subverting Grievous.
Similarly, her use of telekinesis was potentially devastating, and she has blasted targets with enough force to reduce them to a bloodied pulp, and even blasted apart her own cousin's hand, leaving him with a bloody stump in place of an arm. However, she has never made a conscious use of such overtly destructive telekinesis in battle. Neither has she ever settled a fight with an opposing Force wielder purely on the basis of her telekinesis, and those capable of erecting Force shields for defense have little difficulty turning aside such attacks from her. Though to her credit, she possessed the same familiarity and depth of skill with raising telekinetic barriers for defense, as well as to prevent herself from being telekinetically disarmed.
Obviously, Grievous's inability to employ telekinesis means that Zannah doesn't have anything to worry about here, but she's also not well placed to batter him around in turn. For starters, she doesn't employ her abilities all that frequently. Secondly, on those few occasions where she has, the only times she has dealt out an insane amount of damage have been against non-Force sensitives in general, or those who have been specifically noted to be weak in the Force. Those mild shortcomings aside, she clearly possessed adequate telekinetic power to kill most targets. But Grievous is a cybernetic monstrosity unlikely to be dispatched with such ease. It is true that he was nearly crushed by Mace Windu, but no other telekinetic attack leveled against him has ever resulted in such catastrophic injury. In fact, most have failed to hit him at all, and he has proven that he can deal with more indirect methods such as telekinetically thrown objects. Except for that one time.
Zannah's abilities with telekinesis afford her with a notable and obvious advantage, though nowhere near enough to afford her the decisive edge overall, and ironically for a Sith sorceress, she lacked the ability to generate or manipulate Sith lightning. She never conjured it, and her only defense against it was to deflect the torrents of deadly energy with her lightsaber blades.
As before, Grievous's inability to conjure lightning means that her lack of affinity won't really come into play. However, her implied inability to utilize Tutaminis means that she would have to rely on her weapon to deflect blaster fire should the general use his backup pistol, and would certainly rule out any chance of her catching an opponent's lightsaber blade a la Satele Shan.
Zannah's skills of concealment and stealth were also highly advanced. Remnants of her concealment spell at the healer Caleb's hut on Ambria endured and held a presence in the Force for a decade after she'd cast it. Perhaps her greatest achievement in this field was when she successfully infiltrated the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, blinding the Jedi she encountered with a spell that projected a false light side aura, enabling her to masquerade as a Padawan with access to the Jedi Temple archives.
These are mentioned merely to provide an accurate accounting of what Darth Zannah was capable of. In open combat, these powers have no real relevance. They're not something Grievous has a direct answer for, but that wouldn't influence the outcome of a contest between these two in any case.
Darth Zannah's most destructive ability was the trump card she used to finally defeat her master during their final duel. Calling upon the latent dark energies trapped and buried within the planet like those of Lake Nath, Zannah conjured tendrils of pure, dark side energy, taking the form of a flesh and bone disintegrating mist. The use of this power required her to gather her energies, which took some time and was highly labor-intensive, requiring all of her focus and leaving her prone to attack while in use. For that last reason in particular, this is not an ability she will employ except as a last resort, as it is so risky. It also remains unclear whether she was capable of calling upon this power on her own at any time of her choosing, or if she requires a potent source of external darkside energy to accomplish this. It is my personal belief that the latter is true, as she was noted in the text of the novel to be drawing on power which had been buried within the planet's surface for centuries, and only used the power on that one occasion. Notably, she did not even attempt to use the power when she and her master fought earlier on more neutral ground. Quite a different arena than the nexus of darkside energy that was Ambria.
Now, this is a bit of a difficult call to make due to the novelty of the ability and the strange parameters around its usage. First of all, it is unlikely she would be able to call upon them when fighting on even ground in any case. Even if she could, the ability would almost certainly manifest to a far lesser degree than she displayed on Ambria, due to the fact that she was specifically drawing on a centuries-old source of external power, which she most certainly would not normally have access to. Lastly, the only materials we have seen the tendrils dissolve have been Darth Bane's clothing and, of course, the Dark Lord's own flesh and bone. While it's certainly possible that tendrils could destroy Grievous's duranium alloy frame, we don't know this with absolute certainty. That said, Darth Bane actually recovered from the mind-numbing pain of the first injury sustained from the tendrils, and went on to nearly defeat Zannah using essence transfer following the second. Grievous has the potential to outmaneuver the tendrils just as Bane did for the most part, and, unlike the Dark Lord, he would not have to put up with crippling pain unless fatally injured, as his only remaining organic parts are concealed well within his cybernetic shell. While there is a degree of guesswork involved in this ruling, all we are inclined to state with certainty is the likelihood of Zannah's tendrils coming into play in a contest on even ground is rather low, all things considered.
Finally, Darth Zannah's mental powers were where she truly shined. Though she was of course skilled with a more commonplace mind trick, as she demonstrated during her mission to Sereno, her greatest talents had a far more profound impact on her targets. Her go-to Force abilities were her terrifying spells of madness, Sith techniques which afforded her the ability to induce madness by invading her target's psyches and torturing them with horrific visions until they were either driven wholly insane, or simply in order to soften them up for a killing blow once the opportune moment presented itself. There are some within the fanbase who view this ability as an infallible form of attack, guaranteed to deliver victory. However, while the effects have proven absolutely devastating against certain opponents, they were not without their limitations. For example, we have never seen Zannah reduce a great Jedi Master to pieces in such a manner before, as Sorceress, like his teacher, Rasta Lusu, was the type of Jedi specifically noted to be weak against force-based assaults. When faced with a mental assault of this precise nature, initiated by Alima Keto, the Jedi Knight Nomi Sunrider successfully employed an internalized form of battle meditation, enabling her to identify the illusions for what they were and dispel them. Even beings who lacked mental abilities of this nature proved equal to the task of negating their awesome power, with Darth Bane himself perhaps being the best example. As the Dark Lord proved, a being who has already come to terms with their psychological turmoil and deepest fears possessed the self-actualization required to combat these abilities. Coupled with this self-actualization and the ability to recognize the illusions for what they were, the true secret to dispelling the visions of madness was a simple matter of willpower, as Darth Bane demonstrated during their final showdown on Umbria. While I certainly consider this power to be potentially devastating, I definitely think this is an ability that has been drastically overrated by those who view it as an absolutely infallible and unavoidable weapon. The success rate of a technique like this depends very much on the innate abilities of the opponent it's being used against.
Still though, overrated doesn't mean dismissible. And when we examine the vitality of these spells against Grievous, it becomes apparent just how effective a weapon they can be. While the General does have his moments of being a cold and detached machine man, he is far and away from what we would call emotionally stable. His past is rife with demons for Darth Zannah to exploit, and his mind was literally reprogrammed to be more violent and instinct-prone. More to the point, Grievous has shown himself to be vulnerable to lesser forms of mental manipulation. The most notable instance being when Palpatine casually mind-tricked him after letting him get captured during the Battle of Coruscant. Now yes, one must always be careful when comparing Palpatine's feats to those of others considering his status as the most powerful of the Sith, but Zannah is an apprentice of the especially formidable Baneite line, and her specialty is mental manipulation. While it is entirely possible that Grievous's superior physicality and martial arts talent could pressure Zannah into being unable to utilize her spells in the vein of Sorceress, we don't consider this to be the most likely outcome. Zannah improved greatly as a duelist and sorcerer between the events of Rule of Two and Dynasty of Evil. By then, it was really only her tactical awareness and limited skill set which continued to encumber her. Her final performance against Darth Bane, during which she employed her Sith spells while afflicted by broken ribs, proves that she could work under duress, so long as her opponents don't completely and utterly outclass her, which Grievous wouldn't. So, at the end of the day, what does this all boil down to? Well, before we give you our ruling, please allow us to briefly recap. As discussed previously, Zannah's physical attributes wouldn't provide her with a firm foundation to counter or surpass Grievous. Her choice of weapon would actually act as a hindrance in this scenario, and beyond all else, her variant of Surisu, while formidable in its own right, differed very sharply from Obi-Wan Kenobi's.
Although this has never been stated in universe, our shared personal belief is that the greatest Surisu specialists of the Sith would never quite measure up to the greatest Surisu masters of the Jedi. In the same way that the fiercely passionate tenets of Juyo fly in the face of the rest of the Jedi Order's teachings, the pacifistic and strictly defensive philosophy of Surisu fails to align with the very nature of the dark side. This isn't to say that a Jedi cannot be expert with Juyo, or that a Sith cannot master Surisu. They clearly can. But the results are almost always the product of an intense clash of discordant nature and opposing philosophy. It's as if they're attempting to will something into existence that was never meant to be.
And this is what ultimately drew me to this matchup in the first place. I wanted to demonstrate how sharply divorced two different applications of the same fighting discipline could be. Zannah is a technically proficient Sorisu master, as good with the style as it is possible for a Sith to be. But when it comes down to it, she specialized in it as a matter of practicality, as she wasn't physically suited to the other styles Bane could have taught her. Sorisu was just another tool in her repertoire. By contrast, Kenobi is transcendent with the art. He is better than he ought to be because of it. The form does not compensate for any innate weaknesses and instead elevates his practice of martial arts in a grander holistic sense. For him, Sorisu is more than a mere tool or fighting style. It's a way of life. Obi-Wan Kenobi is Sorisu.
All of this boils down to a singular likely conclusion. Darth Zannah, while not as pure in her approach to Sorisu as Kenobi, is just as capable of defeating General Grievous as the quintessential Jedi Master is, though not by way of the sword. On that count, Grievous maintains a solid advantage. In a very real sense, the only offensive abilities Zannah has going for her, where a contest between these two is concerned on neutral ground, are her Sith spells. It is somewhat questionable whether she would think to use them when dropped in cold against a cybernetic opponent. However, Zannah is shrewd and observant, capable of taking in relevant details and reaching prescient conclusions very quickly. We believe that she would be capable of surmising her opponent's true roots as an organic being after only a brief exchange with him, and would almost certainly employ her Sith spells as a survival tactic if nothing else. In other words, she wouldn't allow herself to fall before exhausting her bag of tricks.
We believe this fight would be fairly brief, with Zannah being forced almost immediately onto the back foot by the Separatist commander, and only barely able to keep up with his unorthodox approach and freakish physical abilities. Her analytical mind, though quite capable, would come up short against his own computers, which would discern and adapt to her technique nearly instantaneously. Visually speaking, the initial bout would be quite similar to that between Grievous and Shakti on Hypori. Eventually, Grievous would seize the advantage, either injuring Zannah in the process, or else disarming her, or perhaps even damaging her weapon, leaving her backed into a corner with no place to run and no means of challenging him, save one.
In truth, the power of the Force is all she really has going for her here. But a powerful ally it is. General Grievous's proven vulnerability to mental assaults, lack of familiarity with Sith magics, and inability to mount up a strong defensive countermeasure would seal his fate, ultimately destabilizing him and leaving him open to a lethal follow-up attack.
Darth Zannah is awarded the edge in force abilities and contingencies. And because we consider this to be the most influential factor where a duel to the death between these two is concerned, this ruling carries significantly more weight than the others. Although it wouldn't be easy for her, and she would really only be coming out by the skin of her teeth, we proclaim Darth Zannah the victor. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this entry in Versus Series Season 7. As always, please leave your thoughts and questions in the comment section below. Thank you to Grey Jedi 91 for joining me for this collaboration. May the Force be with you, stay safe, and I'll see you guys later.